Hello, and welcome to Uptime, the podcast from Med Healthcare Business News. We talk with experts about the issues shaping healthcare technology and the medical equipment industry. I'm your host, Carrie Stevens. Today, we're digging into new research from the Harvey L. Neiman Health Policy Institute that looks at a growing challenge in radiology, physician turnover. Published in the Journal of the American College of Radiology, the study found radiologist turnover increased 61% between 2013 and 2022, raising questions about workload, burnout, and the long-term stability of the imaging workforce. There's also a full article about the study on .med Healthcare Business News. And as a reminder, HCB News is free to read. So if you're not already registered, you can sign up at .med.com/news. Joining me in conversation today is Dr. Eric Christensen, Research Director at the Neiman Institute. We'll talk about what's driving the turnover and what radiology practices can do about it. Eric, thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm just going to jump into this because one of the things that I found so interesting was, a lot of people looked at COVID-19 as the catalyst for so much turnover, but turnover was already rising before COVID. So what structural changes in radiology or healthcare do you think triggered that trend?
Yeah, I think there's multiple things going on. One is volumes in radiology are increasing over time. That's been a consistent pattern for a couple of decades. So you have increasing volumes, you have population growth, population aging, and of course, older people use more imaging, which again drives more volume. And so all these things combined to essentially put extra pressure on radiologists to interpret imaging. One thing I would add is when we're talking about increasing volumes, radiologists generally aren't the ones ordering the imaging, but they are the ones who have to deal with it once it's ordered.
One of the things that was really highlighted in the study was it found a U-shaped relationship between workload and turnover. So what does that reveal about how radiologists experience productivity pressures?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing from an economic standpoint, and I'm an economist, is there's generally kind of a sweet spot or, a point where something is best. And so if you want to look at where do you get the lowest turnover, there's going to be a workload level that's probably associated with that. And so if you just think about this logically, if you're in a job and you don't have a lot to do, that job is not very engaging. It's not very financially rewarding. And so as the workload increases, both of those factors, both the engagement of the job and the financial rewards increase up to a certain point to where you're working all the time and you're stressed. And at that point, more work is just more work, and it's kind of self-defeating at that point. And so you reach this point where turnover kind of bottoms out and then begins to rise as workload continues to increase.
Well, another interesting thing was the workload threshold is significantly lower in academic radiology than in non-academic practice. So why do you think that is? Interesting.
Yeah, so that is one that we would have hypothesized beforehand that we would see a lower threshold in academic radiology. And that's just because the mission of kind of academic and non-academic radiologists is different. Non-academic radiologists, their job is to do clinical work, whereas academic radiologists, they do clinical work, they also teach, they also do research, and so there are different demands on them. And so as their clinical demands increase in academic radiology, something has to give. There are only 24 hours in a day. And so something else has to get squeezed out. And what tends to get squeezed is what we would call protected time or non-clinical time that's used for research. Teaching gets squeezed. There are other studies that kind of show this impact on teaching. And so as those other missions get squeezed, the appeal of being an academic radiologist probably decreases because you're not doing as much of the teaching and research as you probably had planned. And so you reach that kind of pain threshold where the gains from extra clinical work have already bottomed out, and now more clinical work is kind of driving you out.
Yeah. And another main thing that was highlighted was that female radiologists are more likely to leave. And so, I think that definitely opens it makes sense in a lot of ways that, a lot of times women are the ones carrying the brunt of the household work if they have children. I mean, there's definitely reasons, but what specific workplace challenge changes could realistically improve retention for women in radiology? Because women need to be in the field. It's very important for them.
Sure. Well, our study, didn't address exactly what could be done. It addresses some of the issues, but I think there are some logical things that we can think about. But if we want to get more specific about exactly what should be done, probably there should be some additional study in that. So, yes, there was a difference for women. Their attrition rate was about six. The odds of their attrition was about 6% higher. So not a ton higher, but a little higher. Um, they tend to sort themselves more naturally into academic practices than they do non-academic practices. So is that because academic practices are a little bit more family friendly, in terms of schedule, perhaps? Um, so that could be one thing, kind of a signal of, to the degree that there's more flexibility, that there is some kind of constraints and bounds on the work, those kind of jobs may be more appealing to them. As you mentioned, a lot of family responsibilities still fall on them. Kind of the traditional things of caring for aging parents or caring for children. And so there are demands on them outside of work that are maybe not as felt as strongly among men. And so um, again, that burden might just be a little bit more on them.
That makes sense. So, metropolitan practices also had higher turnover. What factors make urban radiology environments particularly challenging, in your opinion?
Yeah, that one I feel is, um, again, we don't know the exact reason. We see that there is a distinction and there is a difference. Um, it could be that their workload is just a little more demanding than, say, more kind of rural practice in terms of the intensity. Generally, in urban areas, you have, kind of academic medical centers, and of course, the complexity of the work is different and those kinds of things. So that could be a factor. Urban centers also tend to treat um, a a more challenging patient population um, in terms of demographics. You might have more urban poor that are being treated, and that's potentially challenging. Again, I think we don't know the exact reasons, but again, it's if we're trying to understand what can we do about it or what can practices do about it, practices should be aware that there is an impact there, and we need to account for it.
One of the more interesting points, so we did a full article, like I said earlier, about this issue, but IT frustrations were mentioned, So, what kinds of technology issues are most damaging to radiologist workflow today?
Unfortunately, being an economist and not a clinician, I'm not well positioned to answer that. My co-author, Dr. Jake Parikh, would be in a better position to answer that because he is practicing radiologist and deals with those kinds of things. So, unfortunately, I can't give you a great answer on that.
So, if a radiologist practice could implement only one retention strategy immediately, what intervention would have the greatest impact?
In my opinion, again, our study doesn't inform what would be best. Um, I think practices need to recognize the reality of where they are. Um, if you think about this kind of logically, when a radiologist leaves a practice, the practice's workload is kind of exactly where it was. Just because a radiologist leaves doesn't mean they have less workload. And so now the remaining radiologists have to kind of absorb that remaining burden. So there's more workload to be interpreted by everyone else, and there's more call responsibility in the individual radiologist in the practice. And so those things kind of compound. What I would suggest then is that measures should be taken to try not to overburden radiologists, because once you reach this point, it becomes potentially a vicious cycle where somebody leaves, the workload increases for everybody else. And again, that increased burden may drive other people out, and you have this kind of, death spiral, for lack of a better term. And so, to the degree that we can provide flexibility, if people need to have different work arrangements so that they are, that the work is more tenable for them. I think that's a good thing. Um, if there are things that can be done to kind of balance this in terms of, kind of work life, that may look different for different radiologists in the practice, maybe not a one size fits all on this is how we do it. Again, there is no perfect answer here, but I think the point is things need to be tried to see if we can't lower the burden. While workload is not directly burnout, there are other studies that tie burnout to workload. And so that's kind of how I think of this when we look at workload and its effects on turnover. Is it's kind of a signal of burnout. And so to the degree that we can institute different practices to make the practices a little more family friendly, a little more work-life balance for the radiologist, that may be something that helps this turnover issue.
What surprised you most about the results of this study? Was there anything you found particularly interesting or surprising?
I guess I wasn't necessarily expecting that there would be as much difference as there was between metropolitan, non-metropolitan practices. In the sense of I'm not sure I would have guessed the direction that one was higher than the other. I could have easily seen it go the other way. So that was a little bit surprising. Something that we found that was not surprising at all to me is that turnover fell as essentially years of practice increase. So if you think about a very young radiologist who's, kind of fresh out of their residency, they go into their first job and maybe it's a great fit, but maybe it's not. And so in the early years, we kind of expect there to be more turnover as radiologists essentially find what works for them. And so you might have to change practices early in your career just to make that sort out. And I think that's logical, and that applies kind of into any field. As somebody starts a new career and they think, oh, this is what I want to do, and they get into it, it's like, oh, this is not really what I want. I want to do something else. I know at one point in my career, I thought I wanted uh, to essentially be a manager, and I was made a manager and I hated it. So you never know what that might be until you get into it and you see what works. And so uh, after we have that kind of sorting out as radiologists get a little more into their career, turnover naturally falls. And so that's what we're observing. And also as people get more settled, it's a little bit harder to kind of nudge them out of the situation they're in, because it kind of affects a lot of different things, and maybe they bought into a practice, maybe they've obtained tenure, and so there's a lot of reasons why it gets more stable as we go. And so that's something we observed very strongly in our data. And those kinds of things, when we observe this expectation of it, of turnover playing with years of practice as we expected, and as we kind of expected having a lower pain threshold for academics, again, that's as we expected. Those kinds of things to me add a lot of confidence that what we're seeing is an actual representation of what's going on.
I think, one thing that surprised me from writing the article was I thought COVID would have played a much bigger role in turnover because, I can only imagine that, especially in the beginning parts of the pandemic, how many imaging studies these radiologists were reading. So to me, that was a bit shocking. Can you talk about that just a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So that's a great point. I'm glad you brought it up. So as you alluded to, early on in our discussion, turnover rates were rising long before COVID. We saw them rise pretty substantially from 2013 to 2019. And then since COVID has happened, they've kind of stayed at that level. They haven't fallen. And so, is that because we've reached a threshold? Early on in COVID, obviously imaging volumes actually fell. And so in some sense, COVID provides a little relief in that initial period. Now, obviously volumes have very much recovered after there was that, brief period in 2020 where they were down. Um, but it is an additional stressor that is added to things. I wish we had another year or two of data to see if we're maintaining at that same level or if it's going to increase in the future. That I don't know. But what it is clear is we got to a certain level and it has not dropped.
Are there any plans for future studies to look at this and kind of, as a follow-up or anything?
We are considering some other studies that we might do. We've looked at this for, say, radiologists as a whole. There are several subspecialties within radiology, and so one of the questions we're thinking about is, do these patterns look kind of the same for all subspecialties, or are there some that are kind of more affected and some that are less affected? We think that's potentially an important question. For example, is this pattern the same for breast radiologists as it is for neuroradiologists? I don't know. That's potentially useful information when you're looking at a practice trying to decide what to do and how to address turnover issues if they know that certain subspecialties are kind of more prone to it than the.
Absolutely. Is there anything else you want to tell listeners about the study that you don't think we've already covered that you think they should know about?
I think we've largely covered it. This is the first study that really looks in depth at radiologist turnover. So I think it's important that future studies look at this issue as well and unpack it a little bit more, just as we talked about for, say, looking at subspecialties. There are other things that might be driving this. And so, again, this is a first study, a first look. And so, I would fully expect and fully hope that others would look at the issue as well so that we can understand it better.
I know personally, I would like to see other healthcare job titles and just to see how the turnover for those is. I think that'd be really interesting.
Yeah, so one thing I'd mention on that is there was a study done on turnover for physicians kind of generally a few years before. Essentially, what that study found was that turnover among physicians generally was about 5.3% in 2013, and then it rose. I'm sorry, 5.3% in 2010, and then it rose to about 7.6% in 2019. So it doesn't quite get to the COVID period, but those levels of turnover are pretty similar to what we observe for radiologists. So again, that's a broad standpoint, but your point is well taken. This could look very different if we looked at different stuff.
Thank you. Well, okay. So my last question to all guests is, what is keeping you up at night in the healthcare field? And I know you're an economist, but I'd really love to hear what healthcare related issue keeps you up at night, or just you think we should be talked to as a bit of a broader subject.
Sure. So I'm going to give you an economist answer, and that is I worry about the cost of the system. Um, if a fifth of our economy is engaged in healthcare, in my opinion, that's really not sustainable. I think if I'm thinking about what concerns me as an economist, it's the cost of the system, um, and making sure that is one that we can essentially bear the cost of. That's in no way related to what we just talked about today, but for me, that's an important issue.
No, that's very interesting. I haven't heard that one, and I think that could be a broader topic, and I'd love to have you on again to discuss that. So Well, thank you so much, Dr. Christensen, and to our listeners and audience members. Just thank you again. And be sure to check out the next episode of Uptime. Thank you. Take care.
Lucky.